Honourable Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Bravo. Bravo. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So it's an honour, as always, to rise and contribute to the debate on private members' business. And tonight we are debating C-295, moved by the member from Vancouver Centre, whose bill proposes an amendment to the criminal code to create a new offence for long-term care facilities, their owners, and their managers who fail to provide the necessaries of life to the residents of their facilities. It also creates a process by which courts can make prohibition orders against the owners and managers of such facilities and prevent them from being in charge of or in a position of authority towards vulnerable adults, and to consider as an aggravating factor for the purpose of sentencing the fact that an organization failed to perform the legal duty that it owed to a vulnerable adult. And her concern for vulnerable adults is most certainly a credit to the member. And I share this concern. I share this concern for many reasons. As a member of Parliament, many of my constituents have shared with me personal stories about fraud, abuse, and neglect of elderly or vulnerable family members. I share this concern because, like most Canadians, there are vulnerable adults in my family and have been in my family. My own grandfather was defrauded by his caregiver in the final months of his life. I've spoken about it in this place before on other bills designed to enhance protection for vulnerable adults, but I'm going to do so again. My grandfather spent the final months of his life worrying about money and worrying about a possible financial burden on his companion because a caregiver defrauded him. This crime didn't take place in an institutional setting. The perpetrator of the crime provided care to him in his home, preparing light meals and housekeeping. But this was the level of care that he needed to stay in his home with his companion comfortably, and yet he was defrauded. The local RCMP detachment had a poster in the police station imploring people to report fraud and to be aware of elder abuse. And yet, despite obvious and overwhelming evidence, it took months for charges to be laid. They kept saying they were too busy to get around to arresting the suspect. This resulted in my grandfather passing away before they eventually arrested and charged the caregiver who preyed upon an elderly couple in their own neighborhood. So I mention this episode again in this House to be clear that I know firsthand how vulnerable seniors, how vulnerable adults can be prone to abuse, fraud, and neglect. And I know firsthand how poorly the justice system reacts to such cases of abuse and fraud. And so I can only imagine how slowly and reluctantly authorities react to cases of neglect. There's no doubt that much more needs to be done to protect vulnerable adults. My family experience is enough to convince me of that, even if I didn't also have the weight of so many similar stories from the people that I represent in Calgary. I'm also very concerned about the rise of incidents of violence against seniors. We know that under this government's watch, crime has gone up significantly in every category, but according to Statistics Canada, the rate of violence against seniors has gone up faster than the increase in violence against all other age groups. I too was appalled by the collapse of care in some seniors' homes during the early weeks of the pandemic, and appalled that the military was called in to restore the most basic care and ensure that the necessities of life were delivered to helplessly vulnerable seniors. But this bill is not about establishing who cares the most about seniors. It's not about how to fix shortcomings in the seniors' care system. It's not about how seniors' care is funded or how it's delivered. It's not about regulating standards of care in long-term facilities. This bill is a criminal code amendment. The bill amends the criminal code to create a new offence and give additional order-making power to courts. And it was supported by parliamentarians at second reading, was referred to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. And during the hearings, Madam Speaker, 15 provincial long-term care associations, organizations, and businesses submitted briefs opposing this bill. 6 national organizations also opposed the bill, including the Canadian Medical Association, the Canadian Association for Long-Term Care, the Canadian Medical Protective Association, the Canadian Association of Social Workers, the Canadian College of Health Leaders, and CanAge. These associations raised concerns about the unintended consequences of this bill. Some said that if passed, this bill would have a devastating impact on recruitment and retention by creating undue risk and hardship for frontline staff. They raised concerns at committee that this bill will exacerbate what is an already precarious situation with chronic labor shortages in the industry. It was also remarked that this bill and the debate around it has had a tone of general opposition to privately owned long-term care facilities in favor of publicly operated ones. And so those who assert, without evidence, mostly just philosophical conviction, that privately owned and operated long-term care facilities are more prone to instances of neglect than publicly owned ones, they could run for provincial office. They can get involved in the regulation of healthcare facilities, which is where such facilities are regulated, and the general regulation of commerce. They could also consider whether a new offense and new order-making provisions is the best way to protect vulnerable adults. Or perhaps they could propose comprehensive anti-elder abuse legislation, something that the previous Justice Minister was tasked with in his mandate letter, but failed to actually do before he was shuffled. During the 2021 election, this government promised a Safe Long-Term Care Act, but they have not introduced one. The criminal code really is a blunt instrument, Madam Speaker, and given the testimony at the Justice Committee, one really must consider whether this bill will help vulnerable adults or whether, through unintended consequences, make the highly stressed system of care for vulnerable adults worse rather than better. What good, Madam Speaker, are new offenses in the criminal code when existing offenses are not enforced? When prohibitions against fraud, abuse, and failing to provide the necessities of life already exist in the criminal code, but we need better enforcement and prosecution of our laws. What good is a new offense if existing offenses are not enforced? And we've seen this before with private members' bills. When a member proposes a change to the criminal code in order to draw attention to an issue, force a vote in the House of Commons to signal concern about an issue, but without actually creating a comprehensive solution. Now, this is admittedly part of the limitations of private members' bills. In this case, the member for Vancouver Centre cannot propose changes that commit public money. She can't propose provincial regulations in a federal House of Commons. The criminal code is one of the things that a private member can change, but it's, again, a blunt policy instrument. It is a long and complex law already, and I don't like to have to criticize a bill for what it doesn't do, but if one just focuses on what this bill actually does, we have to consider the evidence that was presented at committee. We have to be concerned about the consequences and consider whether or not there are already provisions in the criminal code and can and should be applied to horrific cases of abuse and neglect when they arise. And so, as I've said, when existing laws to protect the vulnerable are not a priority for law enforcement and for our courts, what is the point of passing new laws? So while I commend the member for trying to deter and punish future cases of neglect through the criminal code, I won't support the bill because given the evidence of harm that it will cause to the ability of existing facilities to retain workers, attract investment at a critical time when facilities are struggling with acute labor shortages and rising costs.